Is the United States government hiding significant, even crucial information about UFOs? Was the Air Force Project Blue Book just an elaborate cover-up designed to prevent the public from learning the truth? Why was the project summarily dropped? Were too many people getting too close to the amazing facts already in the possession of the Air Force? The search for the astounding truth behind Project Blue Book in this chapter of UFO Diaries. The mystery behind the UFO phenomenon has puzzled people all over the world. What are these things? Where do they come from? And what is their purpose here? Do all the unidentified objects seen by thousands of witnesses always turn out to be something familiar or natural? Or are they sometimes proven to be something not made on Earth? If even a few of the UFOs sighted are in fact visitors from another world, how should the governments of our world react? Should they treat these strange flying craft as friends or assume them to be enemies? How have we responded to UFOs in the past? Has an official policy ever been stated by the leaders of our planet's nations?
The American government's policy on UFOs has taken some bizarre twists and turns in the last 50 years.
To the best of our knowledge, this all began in 1947 with a private plane flying over Washington state.
A businessman, Kenneth Arnold, saw 9 crescent-shaped objects flying in an echelon formation near Mount Rainier.
And he naturally thought that these were planes, but they were not behaving like any airplanes he had seen.
He told reporters at Yakima, Washington, that the motion of the objects he'd seen was like that of a saucer skipping across the pond.
This was the first sighting to really stick in the public mind, and it gave it the term flying saucers.
Based on Arnold's experience as a pilot, based on his credibility as a businessman, there seemed to be little reason not to accept what he'd said. When the Air Force finally issued their official explanation for the Arnold sighting, they said it was a mirage, some kind of apparition floating in the atmosphere.
After that sighting, hundreds of people saw objects in the sky and reported them to the Army Air Force. And in September 1947, Lieutenant General Nathan Twining, head of Air Materiel Command, wrote to the office of the Commanding General of the Army Air Forces. And in this letter, he strongly recommended that an official investigation be carried out. And on December 30th that year, a project was approved and given space at Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. The general public knew that the Air Force had started some kind of hunt for flying saucers. So the operation was widely referred to as Project Saucer, but its official code name was Project Sign. Now, Project Sign supposedly was an earnest attempt to discover the truth about UFOs. But from its very first investigation, it was clear that something else was going on behind the scenes. What appeared to be going on was an attempt to conceal the whole truth about the matter. And this was especially tragic because the first known investigation involved the loss of life in pursuit of an alien vehicle. On January 7th, 1948, Flight Commander Thomas Mantell was ordered to investigate a UFO flying over Godman Field, Kentucky. After climbing to 23,000 feet, ground personnel lost sight of Captain Mantell and the alien vehicle. But he reported by radio that he was still closing in on what he described, a tremendous metallic object. And as far as we know, that was Captain Mantell's last message. At 5 p.m. that night, the wreckage of Captain Mantell's P-51 airplane was discovered, with his body still in the cockpit.
What really happened? Was Mantell's plane destroyed because it came too close to a UFO?
We know this, that every tiny piece of wreckage of his plane was vacuumed up and hauled away and classified. Why?
Because he was reporting live to the control tower what he was seeing and what he was doing, up to the point where he apparently passed out from lack of oxygen. And of course, Project Sign investigated and decided what everybody was really seeing was planet Venus.
The Air Force said some of the most stupid things to explain Captain Mantell's death. Captain was a very highly trained pilot, very experienced, intelligent young man. They insulted his intelligence, first of all, by saying he'd been following the planet Venus. They also stated that he climbed too high, got out of his oxygen, passed out, and crashed. The excuses that they come up with to explain events of this kind are absolutely absurd.
Anything given to Project Sign had to be purged and passed down from upstairs after they found a way to successfully explain it away, either that it was Venus, a star.
But the fact the Air Force ultimately dismissed this sighting as nothing more than Venus suggests they weren't interested in solving the mystery.
In 1947, the United States was just recovering from the Second World War and entering into the earliest days of the Cold War. So it must have been very reassuring to believe that nothing could happen in the sky that the Air Force could not explain. But was that in fact the case? Were UFO reports quickly dismissed because they were all simple cases of mistaken identity? Or was there another reason?
Can't comment.
Project Sign continued to find explanations for many of the sightings that were reported to them. But in the early morning of July 24, 1948, something happened that Project Sign could not explain, and that opened the door to a whole new era of UFO investigation.
My instruments have gone crazy.
What was this event that changed the course of the official military investigation into UFOs? The amazing answer when UFO Diaries returns. If the Air Force study of UFOs had at first been skeptical, what caused them to change their minds? Just after 2 a.m. on July 24, 1948, a DC-3 passenger plane was 5,000 feet above Montgomery, Alabama, when the crew and one passenger reported seeing an aircraft unlike any they'd ever seen or heard of. The witnesses were certain that it was neither an airplane nor a weather balloon.
When Project Sign investigated the object seen over Montgomery, Alabama, they discovered that two people on the ground had seen the same thing. Taken all together, these sightings were something that Project Sign could not dismiss as a meteor or a reflection. This was obviously some kind of craft, but there was nothing like it in 1948, at least in our inventory.
But did this unique UFO sighting really change the philosophy of Project Sign?
A problem came when the staff members, who were originally briefed to believe that they were going to have all the information that the Air Force had, came to an independent conclusion that there was more to this than they were advocating.
And the reality and the facts that were sensitive, that really indicated we were dealing with extraterrestrial technology, was never, ever released. There was policy decisions made that that information would never get out. So they would either explain it away or they would insult whoever made the report, and they would even end up insulting some of their own Air Force pilots, which is an absurdity.
I've investigated pilot sightings for many years, and there's a number of reasons why I have chosen pilots as a specialty. One is that they're highly trained. They are in an environment which has a good visibility, usually. Vantage in many directions, for instance. And in fact, they can change the direction of their airplane to follow the phenomenon. Another reason is that many aircraft have special instruments on board that might pick up electromagnetic energy. They can use their radios to call to the ground and ask for assistance, radar perhaps, or weather, or military assistance of some sort, so that they're not just isolated witnesses anymore, but they might be accompanied by other professionals.
If pilots are such credible witnesses, why didn't the Air Force appear to take numerous sighting reports seriously?
I know it's been suggested that our government and other governments have been denying or covering up UFO evidence. If that's true, it's easy to understand. It could be that they are trying to protect some advanced technology development that they're working on. But I think there may be another reason, and that is that if the phenomenon is real, and they know it's real, then they don't want to admit to the public that they can't protect us from the phenomenon.
In 1948, in Project Sign, something called the Estimate of the Situation was written. There's controversy about what was in the Estimate of the Situation and who wrote it, but it stated essentially that this was an extraterrestrial phenomenon, and then went on apparently to give various insights about propulsion systems and things like that. The Estimate of the Situation was then sent to George Vandenberg, who was Air Force Chief of Staff at the time. Vandenberg took a look at this estimate and just thought that the document was just ridiculous, nonsense. He ordered all the copies of it destroyed, and they were, which is why we don't really know what was in it.
If the report contained nothing of a secret nature, why was the order given for it to be destroyed?
General Hoyt Vandenberg was in a position to know the highest secrets of government at the time. He would have known things that he couldn't even tell to the men of Project Sign. And apparently when Project Sign made a report stating flat out that they were extraterrestrial, they evidently hit on something he already knew. So the only thing he could do was reject the report and order every copy of it destroyed. From that time on, we can trace the deliberate attempt on the part of some, not all, of the Air Force to conceal the truth about UFOs.
Every major European power, including the United States, is involved with this research in trying to keep the lid on this thing, to keep the cover on it, to control the release of the information.
But why? Why would the U.S. government first set up a project to learn the truth about UFOs and then destroy its findings? Had Project Sign uncovered a secret it was not supposed to learn? In any case, since Project Sign had incurred the anger of the Air Force Chief of Staff, it should come as no surprise that the project was then disbanded.
Project Sign was eventually changed to Project Grudge to get out what were considered to be soft-minded people, making Project Grudge a little bit more hard-nosed.
And it seemed that they took a whole other vantage point and really tried to collect those people that were willing to put more of a mundane explanation on UFOs.
And Project Grudge then went on to become more of a debunking outfit.
But once again, a remarkable incident forced the military to reconsider. In 1951, Army Signal Corps radar tracking stations at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, spotted a number of fast-moving unknowns over that military base. These same objects were seen by people on the ground, and they were reported to approach and depart from the area repeatedly.
By now, the U.S. was becoming involved in the Korean conflict, and it was the height of the Cold War. Any object traveling that fast on radar was assumed to be an enemy missile. This missile was repeatedly violating our airspace at a speed so fast that we could not possibly intercept it.
There were government authorities and scientists who had concluded from the very beginning that the evidence that they had indicated that we were dealing with an extraterrestrial intelligence.
First of all, it was a major sighting year. The 1952 wave was one of the largest waves of sightings that we had.
They either had to explain away the event and tell people that they misunderstood that they were looking at Venus or whatever. They came up with some of the most absurd answers, and they insulted the intelligence of a lot of American people.
The problem was, even Project Grudge had a significant number of cases which could not be identified.
Many people were becoming frightened. The nation turned to the Air Force for explanations.
The Air Force, no matter how much they tried, couldn't really get away from having to deal with the situation, and there continued to be UFO reports.
By 1951, Project Grudge became Project Blue Book,
Which was, quote-unquote, the open project, which was to be able to study and collect reports.
Would Project Blue Book finally begin a serious investigation of UFOs? Would the Air Force, at last, use their resources to discover the truth?
is something.
The astonishing orders that created Project Blue Book and the UFO incident that the government could not ignore when UFO Diaries returned. By the 1950s, Americans were reporting UFO sightings in ever-increasing numbers. Most people were very eager for an official explanation of the strange phenomenon they'd witnessed, and they assumed that any such reassurance would ultimately come from the Air Force itself. But if the claims made by some UFO researchers are true, the United States government created a special operation for researching unidentified flying objects, but then dictated what the project would find and what it would not find.
So the Air Force embarked on a mission to go forward and reduce the number of reports to a minimum.
The order was to find explanations for UFO sightings, but not necessarily the correct ones.
And their identifications became outlandish, totally unrelated to what people were seeing, and what they were looking at was not a UFO, obviously. It was something else. Once the reports were reduced to a minimum, it would show people that everything in the sky could be identified.
The Air Force wanted to be able to say, we have the situation under control. After 1953, Project Blue Book was not trying to find out whether there were visitors from outer space.
But assuming that some UFOs were in fact visitors from another world, how could such a fact be kept secret?
Project Blue Book had its sort of glory days in 1952. The head of Project Blue Book at this time was a man named Captain Ed Ruppelt. Ruppelt was a fair-minded individual who took it upon himself to try to solve the UFO mystery.
The credible people telling the incredible stories, as Dr. Hynek used to say.
In this way, Ruppelt was very much like the project's chief science consultant, Dr. J. Allen Hynek. Hynek had been part of the operation since the days of Project Sign as an expert astronomer and a UFO skeptic. Ruppelt and Hynek began their study, and what they learned convinced them both that UFOs represented intelligence not of this earth.
And if Ruppelt and Hynek had any doubts, nothing could have changed their minds quicker than the events of July 1952.
A series of objects were seen flying over the Capitol building and the White House by pilots, by radar operators on radar equipment, and by civilians on the street.
The objects made right-angle turns, extremely fast accelerations, things that are impossible for aircraft of 1952.
Exactly 7 days later, on July 26th, 1952, objects were seen over the Capitol grounds again. An intercept was ordered again, and this time the objects were still there when the planes came. The planes chased the objects for a while, and afterwards the objects flew away. But the press got wind of this. There were sensational headlines across the country, and suddenly the Pentagon was swamped with inquiries, with calls about what was going on. Are we being invaded? Should we run for the hills? What should we do?
Meanwhile, the Air Force held an official press conference. They reported that the radar sightings had not been an attack on the U.S. Capitol, but were simply a temperature inversion. They claimed that pockets of cold air caused the radar to pick up reflections from the ground and mistake them for flying objects. The naked eye sightings were blamed on meteors and the normal excitement of witnesses. It was, after all, the stated mission of Blue Book to investigate and explain these types of sightings.
There were so many calls into the Pentagon that the Air Force and the CIA actually became a little bit worried that these calls would be disrupting the normal channels of military intelligence. So the CIA organized a panel of scientists to look at the subject sort of secretly. This was known as the Robertson Panel, which met in January of 1953.
They sifted through the mountains of evidence compiled by Project Blue Book, the films, the pictures, the movies, and all. After spending only 12 hours reviewing 6 years of research, they issued their report. This was the highest level of our government at work.
The U.S. government issues its official edict on the question of flying saucers when UFO Diaries returns. If the Air Force had set up Project Sign, Grudge, and Blue Book for the purpose of explaining UFO sightings, why would the Central Intelligence Agency make its own study of the UFO phenomenon?
Blue Book was merely a public relations front. It was never seriously a program to investigate and determine what was really going on.
Well, it looked like they simply wanted to find out whether UFOs were a secret Soviet weapon or not, and if the UFO situation was as it appeared to be, whether there was an opportunity for the Soviets to use it against the United States.
5 major scientists looked at the subject and decided some very critical things. They decided, first of all, that the objects themselves probably were not extraterrestrial. In other words, they couldn't see, they couldn't understand the evidence for the extraterrestrial aspect of the phenomenon. But they decided that reports, not the objects, but the reports themselves, did in fact constitute a threat to the national security.
They began at that point a systematic program of deception, demystification, and disinformation, and those 3 aspects apparently have continued to this day.
They made no attempt to explain what UFOs were. They just set down a policy to teach people that flying saucers didn't exist.
Therefore, the Robertson panel endowed the Air Force with a mission. And the mission was not to study UFOs, not to try to get to the bottom of the UFO mystery, but to reduce the number of reports to a minimum and thereby end the threat to national security. People throughout the society began to criticize the Air Force for not doing its job. And the next thing you knew, the Air Force had a public relations headache on its hands.
From that time on, the Air Force was no longer interested in Project Blue Book. And finally, in December of 1969, they shut it down completely.
Subsequent documents that have been obtained by UFO researchers have shown otherwise, that the Air Force, the military, the CIA, the National Security Agency, a lot of agencies within our own government have been keeping tabs on the field.
The Freedom of Information Act has limited values to the American people, because the National Security Act that was passed at the end of World War II, during the Cold War, states very clearly that any subject or any item of information that could be construed to be threatening to the national security of the United States cannot and will not be released. Now, the Cold War is over. Who is the enemy now? Why are those limitations of the National Security Act still being applied? Why are they still keeping it from us? Under what excuse? Who's our enemy? You come to the conclusion today that people in Washington, at least some of the national security people, look upon the American people as the enemy.
The Air Force has documents on file showing that UFOs have violated our airspace. And if the things that fly right through our radar and violate our airspace aren't a threat to this government, I don't know what is.
If these things are true, then one all-important question still remains. Why?
It's quite simple. They know. They've known for 50 years that extraterrestrials are visiting Earth.
The Air Force believes the truth is simply too much for us to handle, so they lie to us instead.
The quest for the truth about Blue Book and other UFO studies is a tangled mess. Perhaps it's true that the government has used these studies to hide what they really know. Or perhaps they once made a valiant effort to solve a puzzle that is simply beyond human understanding. If so, the real truth may forever be a sealed chapter of the UFO Diaries.